Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings. Welcome to Admiralty Racing. This is a history of the 1950 Formula One season, in which the first Formula One World Championship was held. This is the best reconstruction I could achieve based on a combination of various internet sources and what contemporary articles I could dig up. First of all, we'll go into the history leading up to the first World Championship. Grand Prix motor racing itself, the first ever motor race was in 1894 from Paris to Rouen on public roads in France. Grand Prix motor racing then evolved in France in the first decade of the 20th century before World War I. The first Grand Prix was a literal term used as a prize given for a race in Pau in 1901. The Automobile Club de France then organized the first of what's now considered the French Grand Prix at an early version of what would become the Le Mans circuit in 1906. It wasn't until the period between the World Wars that we saw the development of most of the signal features of what has now become Grand Prix motor racing. Single-seater cars, mass starts, flag and pitboard systems, and timed qualifying, among others, becoming universal. This is sort of the classic era of Grand Prix racing. There was no consistent body of rules or championship system for most of the pre-war period, particularly the 1920s. A lot of racing was based around national teams or nations, which led to the development of the traditional racing colors at the time. Italian red, French blue, German white, and then silver, British green, etc. France was initially pretty dominant in Grand Prix racing, but this gave way to Italy and then in the 1930s to Germany, with the benefit perhaps of certain support from the German government at the time. The first organized championship incorporating multiple Grand Prix was the European Championship, organized in 1931 and most years thereafter until World War II. The European Championship used a very simple system which basically counted points. So the driver with the least points would win the championship. First place was 1 point, and so on. The regulations mostly limited cars by maximum weight in an effort to limit power, rather than the modern regulations, which have a minimum weight. The European Championship initially had 3 races in its first year: Italy, France, and Belgium. The next year, Belgium was replaced with Germany to create the trifecta of the 3 dominant racing powers of Europe. 1931 and 1932 were both won by Alfa Romeos, driven respectively by Ferdinando Manoia and Tazio Nuvolari. The other years had anywhere from 4 up to 7 rounds. Mercedes-Benz and Rudolf Caracciola won in 1935, 36, and 38. Bernd Rosemeyer and Auto Union broke that up to win in 1937. 1939 was never officially awarded due to the outbreak of World War II, and there is, in a sense, a still ongoing points dispute. Germany recognized Hermann Lang of Mercedes-Benz as the winner. Hermann Paul Müller of Auto Union also has a valid claim, but that's hardly relevant here anyway. After the end of World War II, in 1946, the newly renamed and reorganized FIA, Fédération Internationale de l'Automobile, Commission Sportive Internationale, a lot of French words there, created several new regulations to standardize post-war racing, recognizing, like a lot of other sporting bodies, the opportunity to revamp itself in the wake of nearly a decade of no racing. Formula One, initially sometimes called Formula A, was defined as including naturally aspirated 4.5-liter cars, which was the standard pre-war Grand Prix engine size, and 1.5-liter supercharged cars, or voiturettes, which had been sort of the secondary category, something like today's F2 before the war, but without the superchargers that were now added on. Formula 2 was defined as 1.5-liter naturally aspirated cars. Formula 3 as 500cc cars. The first race held to these new post-war regulations is usually said to be the 1946 Turin Grand Prix, although they weren't actually locked in at the time. Achille Varzi won in what would be a 1-2 for Alfa Romeo. As many as 20 or so Grand Prix were held every year from 1946 through 49, Although there was no formal championship system, few if any drivers attended more than a portion of the races. Alfa Romeo won almost all the races they sent a factory team to during those years. In fact, it was the creation of a motorcycle world championship, now known as MotoGP, in 1946 that spurred the FIA to finally create its own World Championship of Drivers for 1950. It would ultimately include 6 of the major national Grand Prix of Europe, plus the American Indianapolis 500 and what was basically just a ploy to justify the World Championship status. So we created the following 7-race calendar: Britain, Monaco, the Indianapolis 500, Switzerland, Belgium, France, and Italy. The points system created for this first season was 8, 6, 4, 3, 2 for the first 5 cars, plus 1 point for the fastest lap, and only the best 4 results for each car out of the 7 counted. Other points would be dropped. In the 1950s, well, things were quite a lot different, as I'm sure many of you know. Drivers could and did switch cars mid-race if their own was ailing. The attendance or the lineups of drivers, teams, and cars changes with pretty much every race. Drivers often simultaneously competed in many other sports car or racing series and switched teams or cars from race to race. Cars were often sold to privateers or independents, and there were no sponsorships of any significance. By modern standards, it was a very disorganized, freewheeling environment. Also, maybe even more notable than any of that, for one used to modernize, my apologies, for someone looking at Formula One from modernized, reliability in 1950 was abysmal. Half or less of the field often finished. So, the teams competing in the first 1950 season. The undisputed favorite coming into the season had to be Alfa Romeo. They were really on a shoestring budget and hadn't raced much at all in 1949, after 3 of their drivers died in a disastrous 1948 season. However, although they were using entirely pre-war engine blocks, mostly pre-war parts in general, they were ready to wage a full world championship campaign in 1950, which frankly is more than most of their rivals could say. They had the Alfa Romeo 158 Alfetta, as it was affectionately known. Designed as a pre-war Voiturette, it had a 1.5-liter supercharged inline-8 engine producing 350 horsepower and ran on Pirelli tires. The engine was really what made the car, and it was a beast of an engine for the time. The 3 Alfa Romeo drivers have all become famous as the 3 Fs. Juan Manuel Fangio, 38-year-old Argentine, was a former long-distance racer in his home country. He had recorded 5 Grand Prix wins in the previous year as a rookie on the European stage, nicknamed El Chueco, or the bandy-legged one, apparently because of his skill in bending his leg to shoot in football games. He had only started Grand Prix racing a couple of years before, so he was a bit of a rookie, but obviously a very, very talented one, and not the age of what we would expect a rookie to be now. His teammates were Giuseppe Nino Farina, 43-year-old Italian, protege of the famed pre-war legend Nuvolari, a long-time driver for Alfa Romeo. His uncle founded the stagecoach styling firm Pininfarina, which is now well known for designing bodywork for Ferrari and other Italian manufacturers. And the third Alfa Romeo driver, the third F, was the 51-year-old Italian Luigi Fagioli, a 25-year veteran of Grand Prix racing who had driven for Maserati, Mercedes, and Auto Union back in the 1930s, after starting his career in 1926. Ill health had started to take a toll on his career before World War II, but the time off had done him some good, and he was in pretty good form for 1950. The major rival to Alfa Romeo would be the Scuderia Ferrari. Formerly Alfa Romeo's factory racing team in the 1930s, after the war it became independent and relocated to Maranello. and produced for 1950 the first fully Ferrari-built Grand Prix car, the Ferrari 125 F1, with its own 1.5-liter supercharged V12 producing 275 horsepower. It also ran on Pirellis. It had only debuted in 1948, but had a fair bit of success in 1949. Ferrari was the team probably most prepared to take the fight to Alfa Romeo and came with 3 excellent drivers of its own. Luigi Villarizi, a 40-year-old Italian who had driven for Maserati. He started racing alongside his brother in the 1930s. Alberto Ascari, a 31-year-old Italian, the youngest man on the grid at this time, I believe, son of a racer who had died while leading the French Grand Prix in 1925, driving a Ferrari-run Alfa Romeo. His father had been a personal friend of Enzo Ferrari before his death. More recently, he had become a business partner of Villarizi and had come to Ferrari on his recommendation. He was also a former motorcycle racer earlier in his career. Raymond Sommer was a 43-year-old Frenchman, the son of an aviation pioneer who had briefly held the longest flight record in 1909. Sommer had won Le Mans 2 times already. This year he would start with Ferrari, but ended up driving a good portion of the season in his own Talbot. Maserati was the 3rd Italian team at the time. Pre-war, the major rival of Alfa Romeo, and arguably, in a certain sense, by the numbers, the most successful post-war team in 1946 to 49, racking up nearly 10 wins or more every year, in considerable part in the hands of privateers, although they did have a factory team. However, this was in no small part because Alfa Romeo hadn't entered quite a lot of the races in that period, the more minor ones especially, while the Maseratis were more prolific. So, the Maserati 4CLT, however, was a development of a Voiturette built in 1939 to race the Alfa Romeo 158. It had its own 1.5-liter supercharged flat 4, producing 280 horsepower, and like the other Italian teams, ran on Pirelli tires. However, that 4-cylinder engine was fundamentally limited and was really being pushed too hard by the addition of the supercharger, which would have a significant effect on its reliability in the course of the 1950 season. Maserati had a factory team, but its driver lineups in general were highly eclectic. The factory team top driver was probably Louis Chiron, aged 50, a Monegasque. He had driven Pitane and Foch as a chauffeur in World War I, or valet if you prefer, in any case. He had first retired in 1938 before the war as the only native winner of the Monaco Grand Prix to date. He unretired after the war, after the long break it had brought about. Then there was Prince Bira, or Birabongse Banudej, a 35-year-old Thai prince, epitome of the gentleman drivers of the period, driving for an independent team run by the Swiss owner Enrico Plate. And then Felice Bonetto, a 46-year-old Italian road racer, privateer, driving a car modified by the Speluzzi works, and engine modified by them as well, nicknamed Il Pirata, or the Pirate, with an image to match. The major rival to these 3 Italian teams from any other country was Automobile's Talbot Darracq, or Talbot Lago, the French sports car manufacturer well known before the war, but financially struggling in the wake of the German occupation during the war. However, it was the leading French team in Formula One and the only major naturally aspirated entry to boot, as the Talbot Lago T26C was powered by a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated straight-six, producing 260 horsepower. It ran on Dunlop tires. They'd had a fair bit of success in the post-war era, but nothing overwhelming to match most of the Italian teams. They too sold their cars pretty widely to privateers, and as a result had a very varied lineup. Louis Rosier was a 44-year-old French Renault dealership owner. He would later help finance and build the Charade circuit. He drove both for the Talbot factory team and for his own Écurie Rosier at different points in the season. Yves Giraud-Cabontus was a 45-year-old Frenchman, a mechanic engineer who won races in his own car in the 1930s after starting racing in 1925. He also drove mainly as a privateer, in fact. Philippe Tancelin was a 53-year-old Frenchman who drove Bugattis, Maseratis, and Talbots in the 20s and 30s. He took up racing after the birth of his daughter when he bought a Bugatti for pleasure driving, and apparently was bitten by the bug. Now, these are just a small cross-section of the number of drivers who actually drove the Talbots. Spoilers, but I've picked the most important and successful ones. However, Talbot and Maserati in particular sold their cars very widely to privateers, and they made up quite a lot of the grid in many races. Other entrants included Equipe Gordini, a French sports car manufacturer associated with Simca, the French associate of Fiat at the time. Founded only after the war, a very new team, and the Simca Gordini T15 was the first major car carrying their badge. It had a 1.5-liter supercharged straight 4 with Englebert tires, an unusual choice. They had a win each in 1948 and 49, but were very much small and unproven. Their drivers were quite similarly young and unproven, in fact. Robert Manzone, a 33-year-old Frenchman who had begun his career as a mechanic and had started driving after the war, one of the few drivers on the grid who made that claim. Signed as one of the first factory Gordini drivers in 1948, he would end up being the longest-lived driver from the 1950 season, as he only died in 2015. Then Maurice Trintignant, an even younger 32-year-old Frenchman. He had actually started racing in 1938, but had his career interrupted by the war as well. He earned the unfortunate nickname Le Pétulé due to a 1945 incident in the first major post-war race, as he had a fuel filter clogged with rat droppings due to being stored in a barn during the war, and thus he became known as the Rat Droppings Man. Unfortunate, but Trintignant seemed to enjoy the title and later named a wine after it in his retirement. The British representatives to rival these French and Italian teams were, well, a couple of teams. ERA, or English Racing Automobiles, was founded in the 1930s to challenge continental dominance in Grand Prix racing. In the post-war era, they had the ERA E-Type, which had a 1.5-liter supercharged inline-6 Dunlop tires. They had taken a couple of wins every year since the end of the war, but it never really looked fast enough to seriously challenge the Italian teams. Their main British rival was Alta. They had actually been the first British constructor to produce a new Grand Prix car post-war based on a pre-war design. Alta was a small specialty sports car manufacturer, and they had no factory team, and their cars were run only by privateers. The Alta GP had a 1.5-liter supercharged straight 4, producing 230 horsepower, and Dunlop tires. There were also a few other drivers around who I couldn't fit in elsewhere. Peter Whitehead was a 35-year-old British driver who drove for ERA and Alta before the war, flew with the RAF during the war and after the war, became the first ever buyer of a Ferrari Formula One car, which he painted British racing green. Quite an incongruous sight. Reg Parnell was a 38-year-old British driver who had been Britain's most successful driver since the end of the war, taking wins in an ERA and a privateer Maserati. As a result, he was invited to drive a fourth Alfa Romeo at the inaugural British Grand Prix, the first ever World Championship race. Dorino Serafini was a 40-year-old Italian 500cc motorcycle European champion who would be given a similar guest drive at Ferrari for the Italian Grand Prix. And Eugène Chabud was a 43-year-old Frenchman who had driven for the French sports car manufacturer Delahaye in the 1930s. His mentor, Jean Tremoulet, had died fighting for the French resistance during World War II. In the post-war era, Chabud drove a privateer Talbot Lago. Now, you probably know that the British Grand Prix was the first World Championship event in history. However, the Formula One season did not really start there, but started with a number of non-championship races, of which there were quite a few in those days, quite a lot more than there were championship races. I'll only go over them briefly, though, as they aren't of as much interest, I think. The Pau Grand Prix was held in southern France near the Pyrenees. Fangio took pole in his own privateer Maserati, which he drove at most of these smaller races that the Alfa Romeo team wasn't interested in. Villarizi and Sommer followed him on the grid in their Ferraris, and Rosier. Gonzalez, Jose Froilan Gonzalez was a fellow Argentinian and a bit of a protege of Fangio, who both of them received backing from the Argentine government for many of these smaller races. And then Ascari and his Ferrari, and various others. A mixed grid with 3 Maseratis, 3 Ferraris, 4 Talbots, and 3 Gordinis. In the end, the event was then duly won by Fangio, ahead of Villarizi, and then Rosier, Sommer. Ascari retired, as did quite a few others, inevitably in those days, but Fangio won the first race of the season. Other early races included the Richmond Trophy, also on April 10th. The starting grid was not as distinguished, with the first qualifier being a certain British Cuth Harrison in an ERA. This was at the Goodwood circuit, incidentally. Then Peter Whitehead in his, well, actually, in a Maserati. My apologies, let me check. Oh, my apologies. That would be Graham Whitehead, Peter's brother, in an ERA B type. No. I'm wrong again. Both Peter Whitehead and Graham Whitehead were present at the race. Peter in a Ferrari, Graham in an ERA. However, Peter was unable to start due to engine problems. In the end, it was Reg Parnell in his independent Maserati that took the win ahead of Baron Tulo de Graffenried in his privateer Maserati, and Brian Shaw Taylor in his ERA. That then was followed by the San Remo Grand Prix on the 16th of April. Ascari took pole ahead of Fangio, who was driving an Alfa Romeo at this relatively prestigious race in Italy. Then Villarizi and Sommer. The appearance of the Alfa Romeos, or any Alfa Romeos in this season, is largely dictated by the size of the prize purse at any given race, I would have to say. Gonzalez and Felice Boneto in his privateer Maserati. No less than 7 Ferraris started and 11 Maseratis, 1 Alfa Romeo, and whatever an SVA is. That would be Società Valdostana Automobili, a very minor Italian automobile manufacturer at the time. Fangio was able to secure the win after Ascari retired, ahead of Villarizi in his Ferrari, and then various Maseratis, other Ferraris, and etc. The final race ahead of the British event was the Grand Prix de Paris on April 30th. Raymond Sommer took pole in not a Ferrari, but a privateer Talbot over Louis Rosier and George Grignard in another Talbot. The starting grid was almost entirely French, with 5 Talbots, 3 Delages, 2 British HWMs, and 1 Italian Maserati. Sterling Moss, who would later become quite famous in Formula One, made his first start here, of this season at least, in an HWM. The result was a win for George Grignard in his Talbot after both Sommer and Rosier retired. Louis Girard and Marc Versini second and third in Delages. And that finally brings us to the British Grand Prix at Silverstone on May 13th, 1950. The first Formula One World Championship race. The Silverstone circuit of the time was 4.649 kilometers, a 70-lap race. A surplus RAF airfield that had just been taken over by the Royal Automobile Club 2 years before in 1948. A fast track, it had probably basically 5 real corners: Woodcote, Copse, Beckett's Stowe and Club. Perhaps 3 more if you count Maggot's Chapel and Abbey. It was marked out, like most tracks at the time, only by oil drums and straw bales, and had no particular safety measures beyond that. Ferrari didn't appear due to a dispute over start money, which is, well, a very, very Ferrari sort of thing to do. However, the British royal family did appear, as did a crowd. Some 21 entrants appeared in all: 4 Alfa Romeos, 6 Maseratis, 5 Talbots, 4 ERAs, and 2 Altas. So, well, if you want to go by nationality, 10 Italian cars, 5 French, and 6 British. Qualifying was on the 12th of May and would see the Alfa Romeos achieve a complete front row lockout. Nino Farina on pole with a time of 1:50.8. Fagioli 2/10 behind him. Fangio 4/10. Parnell and guest driver car 1.4 seconds down, but still on the front row. Behind them came Prince Bira in his Maserati, Gerald Cabantus and Eugene Martin in their Talbots. Baron, it's actually Baron de Graffenried. I think I've mislabeled him throughout here. Louis Rosier, Peter Walker and his ERA, Louis Chiron and his Maserati, Leslie Johnson and Bob Gerard in their ERAs, and de Tonsilline and his Talbot, Cuth Harrison in his ERA, Hampshire in a Maserati, David Hampshire of Britain, Geoffrey Crossley in the first Alta, David Murray in a Maserati, and on the back row, Joe Kelly in an Alta, Joe Fry in a Maserati, and Johnny Clays in a Talbot Lago Talbot, hailing from Ireland, Britain, and Belgium, respectively. So, aside from being an Alfa Romeo lockout of the front of the grid, well, you can see that the Talbots and Maseratis were pretty closely matched for the pace, while the British cars on average were the slowest, with the exception of a few exceptionally slow privateers such as Johnny Clays. As the actual race got underway, Farina retained the lead, with the Alfa Romeos remaining in order. Gerald Cabantus immediately lost 4 positions at the start and dropped right back to 10th. Within a couple of laps, the top 2 British cars, the modern ERAEs, began suffering problems. Johnson had to stop with smoke pouring from the compressor of his car. Walker came into the pits with gearbox troubles and handed over to his backup driver, Tony Rolt. Rolt took over and tried to, well, see what the problem was, but was unable to make any improvement and shortly retired the second ERA, which pretty much ended the main British interest in the race within the first 5 laps, the best remaining ERA being Bob Gerard in 11th at that time. As the race went on, Eugene Martin's Talbot was the next to drop out, with oil leaking all over his engine. The 4 Alfa Romeos led easily from Prince Bira and de Graffenried's Maseratis, then Gerald Cabantus and Rosier's Talbots. Once they had a bit of a lead, the 3 leading Alphas began swapping places, more to entertain the crowd than anything. It had appeared both at the time and now that, in all likelihood, they had been ordered to finish in the order they started for the sake of reliability, and they were basically just making a show of fighting so as not to get attacked by an angry crowd afterwards. Drink. So, as they did that, Fagioli moved into the lead. The 3 lead Alphas had quite a comfortable advantage. Fangio was next to move into the lead. Although the top 3 Alphas probably weren't fighting in earnest, Parnell was nonetheless falling behind them. Tonsilline and a 3rd Talbot had moved up to 9th, while Chiron, Girard, and Harrison were all battling it out for 10th. Shame that didn't pay any points at the time, but as the season goes on, I think you'll see why it didn't. Farina was back into the lead by lap 16. Lap 25, as the race went on, it was Chiron that was out next with a clutch failure owing to an oil leak. Shortly after that, it was Fagioli into the lead again, as the Alphas continued to swap places. Then, as we reached the halfway point of the race, Fangio was back into second, mostly staying ahead of Fagioli, and the pit stop phase began. Cars had to refuel in this era. Alfa Romeos all achieved efficient stops of about 25 seconds, which was quite good for the time. Tonsolin in one of the Talbots had to change his spark plug, which dropped him behind the ERAs of Girard and Harrison. Joe Fry swapped with Brian Shaw Taylor in one of the Maseratis way at the back, just sharing the car for the race, apparently. Unfortunately, on lap 37, Baron de Graffenried retired with a broken connecting rod from 6th, which would have given him a decent points chance, of course, if any reliability struck the frontrunners, or if he could just pass his fellow Maserati driver Pira. As it is, though, out. And plenty more dropped out as the race went on. By lap 45, Crossley retired his Alta with a transmission failure. Murray was out. David Murray was out with an engine failure. And Joe Kelly in the remaining Alta had dropped right to the back with clutch issues and was going quite slowly. Unfortunately, Prince Bira, running in 5th, then began suffering a fuel starvation problem and had to pull over and retire on the hangar straight, promoting Giraud Cabontus in the lead Talbot into the points. As the race came to an end, Fangio began challenging for the lead. Maybe in earnest at this point, agreement or no agreement, Fangio may have wanted to win the race with the championship in mind. Unfortunately, on lap 60, he ran wide and hit a straw bale, which let Fagioli by into second. And as it turned out, Fangio had cracked an oil pipe and 2 laps later had to pull in to retire, ending his race, promoting the second Talbot of Rosier into the points and leaving only 3 Alfa Romeos. That said, the remaining 10 laps were fairly uneventful. Fagioli closed up on Farina, and the 2 lead Alphas finished close together in a crushing 1-2-3 victory for Alfa Romeo in the first ever Formula One Grand Prix, World Championship Grand Prix, that is. Farina secured the fastest lap as well with a 150.6 set back on lap 2, thereby taking maximum points and the £500 prize money available. And here's just a fine image of Farina being followed by Fagioli, I think towards the end of the race. So, here we have the final point scores of the race. Farina, Fagioli 2.6 seconds behind him, and Reg Parnell 52 seconds behind him. All Alfa Romeo drivers on the podium. Also taking points, Yves Giraud Cabontus and Louis Rosier in the Talbots, 2 full laps behind the 3 leading Alfa Romeos. Other finishers included Bob Girard and Cuth Harrison, 3 laps down in their ERAs. Tonsolin, 5 laps behind in his Talbot. Hampshire and the Fry Shaw Taylor Maserati, 6 laps down. Clays in his Talbot, also 6 laps down. Joe Kelly was still running at the end, but was fully 13 laps behind in his Alpha and wasn't classified. That left the championship standings after 1 round at Farina 9, Fagioli 6, Parnell 4, Giraud Cabontus 3, Rosier 2. There was no official Constructors' Championship in 1950 and wouldn't be for several years thereafter. However, just for the sake of analysis and comparison, I'll keep track of one using what would be the rules when one was created a few years later, which is that the top car for each constructor scores, and same as with drivers, only the best 4 out of 7 scores count, that is. So only 1 car per constructor because the number of cars per constructor varies considerably from race to race in this era. That would have Alfa Romeo and Talbot as the only point scorers from race 1. After Britain, the World Championship proceeded immediately onwards to its second round at Monaco on the 21st of May. The Monaco track of the time was very, very similar to the present-day Monaco at 3.181 kilometers, a full 100-lap race. The only major differences from today were the shorter tunnel and the lack of a swimming pool, as the track ran above what's the swimming pool now, through what's currently the pit lane. Ferrari actually did show up in Monaco to make their F1 debut, as did Simca Gordini. So a total of 21 entrants appeared for the race in Monaco. 3 Alfa Romeos, 4 Ferraris, 6 Maseratis, 3 Talbot Lagos, 2 ERAs, 2 Gordinis, and a Cooper. Qualifying was in a bit of an odd format, as the Monaco organizers decided, in an effort to boost attendance, to give the first 5 places on the grid out on Thursday and the rest out on Saturday. Ferrari had only planned to arrive Saturday and only managed to arrive Saturday, and so the best they could do was compete for 6th. As a result, in fact, Alfa Romeo didn't lock out the front row. Juan Manuel Fangio took pole with a 150.2, 2.6 seconds ahead of Farina. Third on the grid was the other Argentine, Gonzalez, in his Maserati. The second row then had Tonsilline in his Talbot, and only then Fagioli in the third Alfa Romeo. When Ferrari did show up on Saturday, they were very competitive, taking 6th and 7th with Villarizi and Ascari, then Louis Chiron in his Maserati, followed by Raymond Sommer in the last Ferrari, Louis Rosier in his Talbot. Then the 5th row, Robert Manzone in one of the Coopers, Bernd de Graffenried in his Maserati, Maurice Trintignant in the other, not Coopers, Gordinis. Trintignant in the other Gordini. Then Cuth Harrison in his ERA, Prince Bira in the Maserati, and at the very back, Girard in his ERA, Franco Roll in a Maserati, and Johnny Clays in his Talbot. At the very end was Harry Schell, an American, in what actually was a Cooper, a Formula 2 Cooper, which he elected to enter anyway, although it must have been hopelessly uncompetitive. Peter Whitehead attempted to enter his privateer Ferrari, but had 3 engine failures in rapid succession in practice and had to give up because he couldn't get the finances to buy another engine on the spot, apparently. Coming into the race, Farina took the lead right off the start, while Villarizi shot up 3 places into 3rd to make up for his bad qualifying. Ferrari's qualifying would have been good enough to be forwards on the grid, except for the strange format, but in any case, Farina took the lead ahead of Fangio and Villarizi off at the start. Unfortunately, immediately afterwards, Fangio retook the lead before the tunnel and was leading when they came into Bureau de Tabac, where Farina slid on waves sloshing onto the track. Remember, there were no real barriers or anything at this time. Hit the wall, bounced back onto the track, and, some of those following were able to dodge his car, but a lot of others couldn't, and the result is that, Fagioli hit the side of the track, Gonzalez hit Farina, and Rosier, Manzone, de Graffenried, Trintignant, Harrison Roll, and Schell were all out on the spot in the resulting carnage, with a couple of other cars damaged to boot. This is the aftermath of the crash. As you can see, the track was almost totally blocked, although racing wasn't halted. On the right there, you see one of the still racing cars winding its way through the wreckage. They didn't have a lot of conception of safety at the time. You can see there's no barriers at all on the track. That's just brick wall. As the lap carried on, Fagioli made it back to the pit lane after hitting the wall, but had to retire. Gonzalez tried to keep going, only for his fuel tank to burst the next lap. His car caught fire. He suffered burns to his arms, but fortunately survived. Villarizi stalled while navigating the wreckage at Tabac and dropped back to last. By the time the wreckage was finally starting to be cleared, Villarizi had climbed his way back up to 5th, much faster than the non-Ferrari entrance round. Chiron was unable to match the pace of the Ferraris, and so fell behind Ascari and Sommer after briefly finding himself in 2nd. And of course, as you may have noticed, there's only one Alfa Romeo left in the race, Juan Manuel Fangio, now being chased by 3 Ferraris. That wasn't much of a problem for him, actually, though, as he pretty well eased away into the distance, too fast for the Ferraris to compete with him. Meanwhile, Villarizi was able to pass Chiron as well and set off after his teammates, actually looking like the 2nd fastest car after Fangio. And sure enough, not long after, on lap 14, Villarizi was able to overtake Sommer and reach the podium positions. He then caught up to Ascari within another few laps, and they began battling for 2nd. And as they reached the pit cycle, Ascari's fuel stop was 5 seconds slower than Villarizi's, and Villarizi went by into 2nd. Meanwhile, Etanseline retired from 6th with an oil leak, knocking, well, how many competitors did that leave in the race? 8. 8 competitors still in the race at this point out of all the starters. Fangio made his fuel stop on lap 52 and stayed more than 30 seconds in the lead. Utterly untouchable by the Ferraris at this time. And unfortunately for him, Villarizi, who had so admirably battled his way back up to 2nd, retired on lap 63 with a broken rear axle, leaving Fangio more than a full lap ahead. He took a 2nd pit stop to top off his fuel a lap later, and would proceed to cruise through the rest of the race, which became increasingly processional. Chiron was, however, able to pass Sommer for 3rd as the Ferrari driver began to struggle with his car, handling issues apparently. In the dying laps, the crowd was provided a bit of entertainment as Girard and Claes battled at the back with the ERA car driver ultimately managing to get past. However, that didn't affect the points as Fangio won the race by a full lap from Alberto Ascari, with the fastest lap as well, a 151.0. So, Alfa Romeo only 1st, but still a win. Ascari 2nd, a lap down. Chiron 3rd at his home Grand Prix, 2 laps down. Sommer in the 2nd running Ferrari, 3 laps down in 4th. And Prince Bira taking the final points in his Maserati, 5 laps behind the leader. The margins were really sort of ridiculous at times in these years. The only other 2 cars to finish were Bob Girard and Johnny Claes, ERA and Talbot, 6 laps behind. So, that left Farina and Fangio tied in the championship at 9 points each, Fagioli and Ascari 6, and so on. There were actually no repeat point scorers between the first 2 races. In our unofficial Constructors' Championship, of course, Alfa Romeo is at maximum points and very nicely placed in the championship. Ferrari 2nd puts it as the 2nd team immediately over Maserati and Talbot. I won't go into detail about the Indianapolis 500 as it wasn't run to Formula One regulations. However, it did technically count for the World Championship of Drivers in 1950 and for some years afterwards. Well, not much to say about it, really. Johnny Parsons started 5th and was able to secure the race win ahead of Bill Holland, Maury Rose, Cecil Green, Joey Chitwood, and Tony Bettenhausen at the famous Brickyard. As a result, he would get the full measure of Grand Prix points, or World Championship points, that were being awarded for any other World Championship race that season. However, there was no overlap between, that is to say, no European drivers went to compete in the Indianapolis 500, and no American drivers came to compete in the European Grand Prix season, so it was really rather meaningless as far as the World Championship went. Immediately after the Indy 500, then, was the Swiss Grand Prix on June 4th at Bremgarten. Bremgarten had been built in 1931 in a forest near Bern as a motorcycle racing track. It was all high-speed corners, tree-lined, uneven, and changing surface. Perhaps a bit like the Nürburgring, although not as complicated and long. 7.28 kilometers. It was a 42-lap race. 18 entrants arrived, the 3 Alfa Romeos, the 3 Ferraris, and 6 each of Maseratis and Talbots. As qualifying got underway on June 3rd, the Alfa Romeos once again locked out the front row. Fangio, 2:42.1, 7/10 of a second ahead of Farina, and then Fagioli. Ferrari, despite their best efforts, didn't have the pace to compete, with Villarizi and Ascari occupying the second row, 4 seconds slower than Fangio. Unfortunately, Raymond Sommer wasn't even really able to compete on even terms, as Ferrari wasn't able to get a third car repaired in time for Switzerland, and so he was given a Formula 2 car for this race, which would ultimately lead to his split with Ferrari, due to disliking the team game, in that regard at least. The third row then, Etanceline and Gerard Cabantus in their Talbots, and Prince Bira in his Maserati, followed by Eugene Martin and Louis Rosier in their Talbots, De Graffenried, Bonetto in their Maseratis, and Sommer in his Formula 2 Ferrari. And then at the back, Johnny Claes in his Talbot, Nello Pagani in a Maserati, and at the very back, Chiron in his Maserati, Tony Branca in his Maserati, and Harry Schell, who drove a Talbot which he had actually borrowed from Louis Rosier. And isn't that quite something? Imagine a driver borrowing another driver's car in modern Formula One. As the race got underway, Fangio was able to hold the lead from pole this time. Meanwhile, Ascari passed both Villarizi and then Fagioli on the opening lap. Prince Bira was able to pass Etanceline, and Rosier passed Martin, significantly reshuffling the order of the Talbots, while Gerard Cabantus crashed at the high-speed Amat right-hand corner, but was fortunately unscathed. As the race moved into the second lap, it became clear that Fagioli really lacked pace among the 3 Alfa drivers, and he was passed by Villarizi as well, and Ascari was able to cling to the back of Fangio and Farina. It looked like for the first time all season, well, granted, one race thus far, Ferrari did have a chance here to compete with Alfa Romeo. Unfortunately for them, on lap 4, Ascari came in to retire with a broken oil pump, dashing Ferrari's hopes of competing for the win. Well, other than Villarizi, of course. By lap 6, Farina had taken the lead from Fangio, with the 2 Alfa Romeos dueling ahead of Villarizi. And then on lap 9, Villarizi's engine blew to, well, turn it into a complete disaster for Ferrari, with Alfa Romeo now 1, 2, 3, and no serious challengers in sight, thanks to Ferrari's reliability problems. As the race went on, Prince Bira made the first fuel stop from 4th, briefly dropping behind Etanceline, but Etanceline himself then began suffering gearbox problems, which dropped him back behind the other Talbots. As the pit stop cycle continued, the pirate Bonetto had a bit of an explosion in his fuel system during his pit stop, but that only slightly delayed him as he carried on anyway. And Raymond Sommer retired his Formula 2 Ferrari due to a suspension failure to cap off the disaster for Ferrari. Unfortunately, Eugene Martin crashed at Amat while battling with Rosier for 5th and the final points position. He was, unlike Gerard Cabantus, who had gotten off lightly earlier in the race, Martin was badly hurt and would not drive in Formula One again, although fortunately he survived. As the pit stop cycle completed, the Alphas had no troubles and found themselves nearly a full lap ahead of Prince Bira in 4th. Etanceline retired from 6th with his gearbox issues proving terminal, which left only Rosier to hold up the Talbot end, but it's a horde of Maseratis surrounding him: Bira, Bonetto, De Graffenried, and Pagani. The Alphas should have been able to cruise to a 1-2-3, but in fact on lap 33, Fangio's engine began struggling while battling Farina for the lead, and he was finally forced to retire. Prince Bira, sitting in what was then 3rd on the podium, shortly afterwards had to make an extra pit stop to fix a mechanical problem. he was able to carry on, but lost out to Rosier, who had adopted a then rare strategy of fueling for the whole race and not stopping, made more possible by his naturally aspirated engine, which didn't guzzle as much fuel as the turbos in the other cars. Unfortunately, that would cost Beer the podium, and in the end, Farina and Fagioli took a 1-2 for Alfa Romeo in formation. Farina grabbed the fastest lap as well as the win, a 2:41.6 back on lap 8. Rosier was able to nab the podium with his no-stop strategy, beating out the 4 pursuing Maseratis. So, Nino Farina by 4/10 in formation over Fagioli, a lap behind Louis Rosier and his Talbot. 2 laps down, Prince Bira and Felice Bonetto and their Maseratis grabbed the remaining points. Other finishers, De Graffenried and Pagani, Schell, Chiron, Claes, and 7 laps down, Tony Branca and his Maserati, a local driver. So that second win of the season, with the fastest lap, left Farina leading the championship with 18 points ahead of Fagioli with 12 from his 2 seconds. Fangio had now retired from 2 out of 3 races, and so was only at 9 points, but hardly out of it with 3 races to go. That said, he was level with Johnny Parsons, the Indy 500 winner, technically. Best outside of Alfa Romeo was Louis Rosier, whose podium in Switzerland, coupled with 5th in Britain, left him at 6 points, well, even with Alberto Ascari, who actually should be ahead on tiebreak, but never mind that. They're both level with Bill Holland anyway. And on from there, Prince Bira, Louis Chiron, Reg Parnell, etc. So far as our unofficial constructors go, Alfa Romeo is still at maximum points, if we exclude the Indy 500, followed by Talbot and Maserati, and then Ferrari, which has got to get its act together as far as reliability goes. Before the next World Championship race would be in Belgium, there was one intervening race, actually earlier in the same week as the Belgian race. The British Empire Trophy was held on a Wednesday, I believe, or maybe a Thursday, but in any case, the 15th of June. It saw a mostly British field led by Cuth Harrison and his ERA, with a lot of Maseratis and ERAs starting. The Douglas Circuit on the Isle of Man. Yes, the Douglas Circuit on the Isle of Man. It was won by Bob Gerard and his ERA over Harrison, and then De Graffenried and his Maserati. Shaw Taylor and an ERA, David Hampshire and a Maserati, etc. None of the real frontrunners in the World Championship entered except maybe De Graffenried. And Bira also entered but retired. Then the Belgian Grand Prix, the 5th round of the season, and yes, very short season in these 8 days, of course, was at Spa-Francorchamps on the 18th of June. Spa of these days was a lot different than the present-day Spa, designed back in 1920 using all public roads, linking the Belgian villages of Francorchamps, Malmedy, and Stavelot. Since the only changes made between 1920 and 50 were mostly to increase the speeds, especially adding Eau Rouge. It was basically unmodified for racing from public streets and was probably, in this form, the fastest and most dangerous track in Europe. At 14.12 kilometers, 35-lap race. A lot of teams were distracted by the British Empire Trophy and so didn't appear, and Maserati, after results which they found unimpressive, were opting to take a break to regroup, while Ferrari, themselves unhappy with their performance relative to Alfa Romeo, experimented, giving Ascari a new naturally aspirated 275 F1. It had only a 3.3-liter V12, which was quite a lot less than the maximum displacement of 4.5 liters. That said, at 300 horsepower, it theoretically actually had more power than the old Ferrari, but still quite a bit less than the Alfa. Similarly, in further Ferrari drama, Sommer had quit Ferrari and drove a privateer Talbot Lago for the remainder of the season. All that news said, with teams distracted and experimenting and so forth, only 14 entrants showed up in Spa. 3 Alfa Romeos, 2 Ferraris, a Maserati, 7 Talbots, half the grid, and 1 Alta. In qualifying, to no one's surprise, the Alfa Romeos again locked out the front row. Farina and Fangio both 4 minutes 37 seconds, and apparently they only timed to the nearest second in Spa. I think that's the only tie it caused, so they probably didn't really need to. Fagioli, 4 seconds behind. Then on the second row, Villarizi and Sommer, 10 full seconds back. And, well, Sommer not really beaten by the Ferraris despite his new privateer car. On the third row, Etancelin and his Talbot, Ascari and his experimental new Ferrari, and Rosier and his Talbot. The fourth row, Giraud Cabantus and Pierre Levey and their Talbots. Fifth row, Eugene Chabud and his Talbot. Crossley, that's Jeffrey Crossley and his Alta, and Tony Branca and a Maserati, and on the very last row on his own, Johnny Claes, the local Talbot driver, who didn't actually even set a qualifying time, but never mind that. When the race started, Fangio was able to get the jump on Farina at the start and went into the lead, while Villarizi went right past Fagioli into third. However, as the first laps went on, Fagioli was able to get back into third, demonstrating the superior pace of the Alfa Romeo. However, it was Fangio and Farina that were pulling away from the pack, battling all the while. Meanwhile, further back, Giraud Cabantus retired with a burst oil pipe. My apologies if I'm mangling the French names horribly. I'm not especially good at them, I know. As the race continued, it was Farina that was able to get into the lead ahead of Fangio, while Villarizi, after his good start, began increasingly struggling with handling problems in fourth and was having trouble keeping his Ferrari on the road. As a result, by lap 10, Sommer and his Talbot had actually passed the Ferrari, and Villarizi was headed backwards. The Alphas made their first pit stops of the race on lap 12. They were planning to make 2. And as a result, Sommer, who was trying the Talbot no-stop strategy, inherited the lead briefly. Of course, that didn't last long, but it did last a few laps. Meanwhile, Etancelin, in the second fastest Talbot, retired with overheating problems on lap 15. It wasn't until lap 18 that Farina and Fangio finally got back past Sommer, who still had more pace than Fagioli. Meanwhile, Villarizi and Ascari made their one stop of the race, dropping back behind Rosier, who was also not stopping. Soon after, it was Fangio that was back into the lead past Farina, while, disastrously, Sommer lost oil pressure and retired from what was a potential podium for the ex-Ferrari driver, which would have been quite a humiliation for Ferrari in the first race after he left them. Meanwhile, Ascari and the experimental Ferrari passed the ailing Villarizi for, well, 5th after Sommer's retirement, so Ferrari still in the points, but barely. And let's see here. By lap 22, Chabud was out with an oil pipe failure, which would bring the field down to 10. Granted that only 16 actually started, so still a pretty nasty attrition rate, but not the worst of the era by any means. The Alfa Romeos made their second stops on lap 23, with Fangio holding the lead, and shortly after that, Farina began losing oil pressure. He made a pit stop in an effort to fix the problem and lost second to Fagioli, but the problem was not, in fact, fixed, and in the end, he just carried on, hoping to salvage points, as he didn't completely lose pressure, but only lost a lot of it, lost a lot of power as a result. He wasn't able to stay in front of Rosier, who passed him on lap 30 for the podium spot. But in the end, he did hold 4th, and on lap 35, Fangio cruised home to win ahead of Fagioli. Sommer got 3rd, thanks to the retirements of quite a lot of cars, but such is life in 1950. Farina was able to hold on to both 4th and the fastest lap point, despite his loss of fuel pressure. and Ascari grabbed 5th and the final points in his experimental Ferrari, but it was not really an encouraging race for them, truth be told. At least they made the finish line. 14 seconds between Fangio and Fagioli, Rosier being 2 minutes 19 seconds behind, Farina 4 minutes 5 seconds in the end, and Ascari a lap down. Other cars, of course, Villarizi and Levey 2 laps down, Claes 3 laps, Crossley 5 laps in his Alta, and Branca 6 laps in his Maserati. So that left Farina still the championship leader with 22 points, but only narrowly now, with Fagioli at 18 thanks to his run of second places, Fangio at 17 with the win, but denied the fastest lap point, which was significant. With another podium, Rosier was now definitely the best non-Alpha driver at 10 points to his name. Ascari had 8. In the unofficial Constructors' Championship, Alfa Romeo was... I debated whether to include the fastest lap point or not, but technically the winning car did not have it, so I didn't. That said, it makes no practical difference. With 35 points and 4 race wins, Alfa Romeo has mathematically secured this little unofficial Constructors anyway, ahead of Talbot, and then Curtis Kraft from the Indy 500, Ferrari, and Maserati. Ferrari, despite clearly the second fastest car, really struggling for results thus far in the season, and now with only 2 races to go to actually get some and prove that pace. Their next opportunity would be immediately after, 2 weeks after Belgium, but there were no other races in the interim, with the French Grand Prix at Reims-Gou. Reims-Gou, my apologies if I'm mangling that again, was first used in 1926. It was a triangle of fast public roads, modified to increase their width and speed for racing. Similar in concept to Spa, but not as long, complicated, or dangerous. 7.826 kilometers, it was a 64-lap race. Ferrari, knowing how much it was down on engine power, withdrew entirely due to the belief it wouldn't be competitive, which, well, is not the way to get a result, but in any case, most drivers actually missed practice, apparently just out of simple not bothering to show up. As a result, nearly half the grid would end up being assigned their grid places by lot. That said, in total, 19 entrants appeared, 3 Alfa Romeos, 1 Ferrari, the privateer of Peter Whitehead, 6 Maseratis, 8 Talbot Lagos, and a Gordini. The Alphas, unsurprisingly, again locked out the front row. Fangio, 2:30.6, 1.9 seconds ahead of Farina, and 4.1 over Fagioli. The second row had Tansanin and Giraud Cabontus in their Talbots. Then Rosier and his Talbot, Roll and Gonzalez in their Maseratis. Levey in his Talbot, the last one to actually qualify, and then given out by lot. Chabud in his Talbot, Bonetto, Parnell in Maseratis, Manzone in a Gordini, Chiron in a Maserati, Claes in a Talbot, Charles Pazzi in another Talbot, Sommer in yet another Talbot, and David Hampshire in a Maserati. And very last on the grid, Peter Whitehead in his privateer Ferrari. As the race got underway on July 2nd, conditions were very, very hot. And with most of the track being at full power, there were immediately concerns about the longevity of everyone's engines. Chabud was unable to even start due to a mechanical problem. Meanwhile, Farina jumped Fangio at the start for the lead. Within a few laps, those engine failures I mentioned turned into a very real problem. On lap 4, Gonzalez was the first to retire with an engine failure, but over the next 10-15 laps, Sommer retires due to overheating. Hampshire, an engine failure. Chiron and Roll, 2 engine failures for Maserati in 1 lap. Parnell, an engine failure on lap 10, which left Bonetto with his modified Milano engine, the only Maserati still running after just 10 laps of the race. All engine failures. Lap 11, Rosier out due to overheating. However, he took over the last Talbot of Pazzi and kept driving. Lap 12, Claes out with overheating. Etanceline, Giraud, Cabantus, and Levey and the other Talbots were all suffering with overheating and made pit stops for repairs before they too had to retire. That would have let Bonetto ahead of them, except that his engine then blew up, leaving the last of the Maseratis, 6 starters, all out before a quarter of the race had gone by, which pretty conclusively demonstrated the issues with that overstressed flat 4. And that meant that miraculously, Peter Whitehead in that privateer Ferrari, starting last on the grid, found himself in 4th, within a quarter of the race distance, having probably only passed Manzone on the track out of everyone. Unfortunately, for the second race in a row, on lap 17, Farina began suffering fuel starvation problems and dropped behind his teammates. He was in the pits for 7 minutes, and still emerged ahead of all the Talbots who had had their own problems in the pit lane, of course. And within a few laps, well, not a few laps, as the race ground on, he was able to get his way back to 4th and keep gaining ground. Etanceline handed over to his friend Chabud at the mid-race fuel stops due to feeling bad for the mechanical issue that had led him to be unable to start. By lap 35, Farina was past Whitehead and back onto the podium, setting off after his teammates, although they had a healthy lead by that time. Whether he could have closed it down at all is a moot point, as 2 laps later, on lap 37, he began suffering more fuel feed problems, dropping back behind Whitehead in the pits. Meanwhile, Pierre Levey was the latest retirement, yet another engine failure. By lap 50, Farina was back into 3rd, his problems again seemingly fixed. And they were not fixed, as on lap 56, his fuel pump finally gave up completely, and he retired a few laps short of the finish. How many laps did I say this was? Well, in any case, not far from the finish. 8 laps short of the finish. And so it was Fangio and Fagioli, another pretty easy 1-2 for Alfa Romeo. Not really competitive in the end, especially with the mass destruction of most of the Maserati and Talbot entries. Fangio did take the fastest lap in this time. Farina's car had probably not been quite healthy for most of the race. And this is basically just an image of what the start-finish on the circuit looked like. As you can see, it's just a massive flat straight. And pretty much that's what the whole track looked like. So, Fangio wins by 25.7 seconds over Luigi Fagioli and the other Alfa. Whitehead takes 3rd in his privateer Ferrari, Ferrari's second best result of the season. 3 laps behind the Alfa Romeos, still on the podium. Robert Manzone and his Gordini, also 3 laps down, takes 4th, and the car shared by Etanceline and Chabud, 5 laps behind, takes 5th. Points are divided evenly between drivers when they share a car in this era, so 1 point each in this case. The other finishers, Pazzi and Rosier, 6th, 8 laps behind in their shared Talbot. Giraud Cabantus technically crawled to the finish 12 laps behind, although, as you can see, he's actually classified behind the retired Farina. With a 3rd win for the year, Fangio took the championship lead with 1 World Championship race to go at 26 points. Fagioli, with 4 second places, had 24, but very little scope to improve his score. Farina had 22. Now, remember, we'll get into the full details of this when we get to the final race, but because only the best 4 out of 7 results count, Fagioli could only increase his score by a maximum of 3 points, where Fangio and Farina had only 3 counting races so far, and so could increase their score by whatever they could score. Rosier with 10, still best of the rest. Then Ascari and Prince Bira, plus, of course, the Americans. And here's the rest of the grid at this point. I won't go over all of them, but you can pause if you like. Whitehead, Chiron, Parnell, etc. In our unofficial constructors, Alfa Romeo, of course, wildly dominant, 36-44. Talbot, still the second best team, ahead of Ferrari, although that third place by Whitehead doing some really important service for Ferrari here to pull them ahead of Maserati, who've had a disastrous couple of races after a pretty decent start to the season. Simca Gordini get on the board with their first 3 Formula One points. Following the end of the French Grand Prix, there was a 2-month break in the World Championship racing schedule, which was filled in primarily with non-championship races of all varieties, some quite prestigious and others not so much. First of these was the Gran Premio de Bari on the streets of Bari, Italy, the Lungomare circuit. Farina and Fangio both showed up in their Alfa Romeos, along with Ascari and Villarizi in their Ferraris. The result was a Farina-Fangio 1-2. Both Ferraris retired. Sterling Moss in an HWM secured third. A much less prestigious race the same day was the Jersey Road Race on the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. Pole position went to David Hampshire. One second. Yes, David Hampshire in his Maserati, ahead of Peter Whitehead in his Ferrari and Bob Gerard in his ERA. Whitehead's Ferrari was the only sort of, well, everything else was a Maserati, an ERA, or something even worse than that. And in the end, Whitehead won the race ahead of Reg Parnell in his Maserati and Baron de Graffenried in his Maserati. The Albi Grand Prix followed on July 16th, held in southern France. Fangio and Farina both raced, but only in Maseratis, as the Alfa Romeo team didn't show up. Ferrari did, but was only 6th and 8th in qualifying due to their, well, they didn't quite have the power on this highly top-speed dependent circuit. In the end, Fangio, Ascari, and Villarizi all retired. And something crippled Farina, so in a race that was run as 2 heats, it was Louis Rosier that won in his Talbot, ahead of Gonzalez in his Maserati and Maurice Trintignant in his Gordini. The Dutch Grand Prix was held on the 23rd of July. Raymond Solmer took pole in his privateer Talbot, ahead of Fangio in the Maserati and his Argentine teammate of a sort, outside of Alfa. Gonzalez, then Rosier. Villarizi and Ascari were only 5th and 7th in their Ferraris. And it was Louis Rosier that took another win in what was a very good season for the Frenchman, in his privateer Talbot, ahead of Villarizi and Ascari in their Ferraris. And then Peter Whitehead in his privateer Ferrari. Fangio retired, while Gonzalez ended up 6 laps down for some reason. It's not clear what his problem was at the time. One of the most prestigious race of this, the most prestigious race between the French and Italian Grand Prix was the Grand Prix des Nations on the streets of Geneva, Switzerland. Alfa Romeo very much did show up with no less than 4 cars. Fangio, Farina, and 2 others. Ascari and Villarizi were able to split them, taking 2nd and 3rd on the grid, with the benefit of Ferrari bringing out the new 340 F1 powered by a 4.1-liter naturally aspirated V12. Still not the maximum size permitted by the regulations, but it made up most of their horsepower deficit and would make them quite a bit more competitive. That said, it was still a highly experimental vehicle, and unfortunately the results at the Grand Prix des Nations would be disastrous. Villarizi crashed late in the race, breaking his leg and killing 3 spectators. Farina hit him at high speed, but was fortunately uninjured. It would have Villarizi out for the last races of the season, and it would be the last Grand Prix de Nations, probably largely as a result. Alfa Romeo ended up with a 1-2-3 with Fangio, the local de Graffenried, who was given a drive for this race, and Piero Taruffi. Ascari secured 4th in the remaining Ferrari, and Yves Giraud-Cabontus in his Talbot was 5th. Ascari had actually retired 6 laps from the end, but still took 4th because of the margin of because of how far ahead the front runners were, essentially. Giraud-Cabontus was 6 laps down, finishing 5th. A few very minor races followed in August. The Nottingham Trophy was a bit of a shambles in which only 3 Formula One cars actually appeared. Hampshire, Parnell, and Jeff Richardson, the former 2 in Maseratis and the latter in an ERA. In the event, Hampshire won by 5 seconds over Parnell. Richardson managed to finish a lap down. The Ulster Trophy on August 12th was held at the Dundrod circuit in Northern Ireland. The starting grid being Brian Shaw Taylor in his ERA, Whitehead in his privateer Ferrari, Cuth Harrison and Bob Gerard in their ERAs, and Joe Kelly in his Alta, with only 9 total starters. It was Whitehead that took another win thanks to his privateer Ferrari over Gerard and Harrison with their ERAs, then Kelly with his Alta, and a certain Tory Large in a Maserati. The Coppa Acerbo was a more prestigious race held at the massive 25-kilometer Pescara circuit on public roads on the Italian east coast. Alfa Romeo did show up with Fangio and Fagioli, along with a collection of Maseratis, Talbots, and 1 each of Ferraris and Jaguars, although the Ferrari entry was was not a factory one, nor was it even Whitehead. It was a strange Chimera car, which we'll talk more about later. In any case, Fangio won the race ahead of Rosier, who actually managed to split the Alfa Romeos, then Fagioli, and the Tonsolini and Neve in their Talbots, the Maseratis not faring well. The Sheffield Telegraph Trophy on August 19th would be even more shambolic, as there were a total of 4 starters. Only one of them, Cuth Harrison, was apparently in an actual Formula One car, and he was the only one to actually finish, which has got to be some sort of record for a race under Formula One regulations that actually went ahead. Much more prominent, the BRDC International Trophy on the 26th of August, which had no less than 27 cars appearing, including the Alfa Romeos of Fangio and Farina, the Ferraris of Ascari and not Villarizi. No, Peter Whitehead, just Ascari and Whitehead. And a whole vast assemblage of, Maseratis, Talbots, ERAs, Altas, and also HWMs, Delages, Bugattis, RRAs, an experimental BRM, AJB. Basically, any sports car manufacturer in Britain or France that could possibly get a vehicle there. It was run as 2 heats, with the best 10 cars qualifying for the final. Fangio and Farina were unsurprisingly the fastest in the 2 heats, and the fastest in the final, with Farina winning from Fangio. Then Peter Whitehead after Ascari retired, and then Cuth Harrison and Brian Shaw Taylor in their ERAs. And after that, finally, we reached the final World Championship race of the 1950 season, the Italian Grand Prix at Monza on the 3rd of September. Monza was in basically its original configuration at the time, minus the high-speed ring, built in 1922 by the Milan Automobile Club. Due to 3 deaths in one race in 1933, the high-speed ring was out of use, which leaves it in an almost identical configuration to the current one, except for the lack of the two chicanes that now exist. As it was the home race of both Alfa Romeo and Ferrari, they broke out all the stops for the 80-lap race around the 6.3-kilometer track. Alfa Romeo brought a full 5 cars to the race, including 3 of the upgraded 159 model for the 3 Fs, their regular drivers. Ferrari brought only 2 factory cars, but these were the latest version, the upgraded 375, well, not even really an upgrade, but an all-new car, with a naturally aspirated 4.5-liter V12, which finally gave them an engine with the displacement and power to rival Alfa Romeo. And a total of 27 cars arrived. The 5 Alfa Romeos, 4 Ferraris, those being the 2 factory cars, Whitehead, and 1 other, 7 each of Maseratis and Talbot Lagos, the 2 Gordinis, and 1 ERA and 1 Milano, just for flavor, shall we say. As qualifying got underway, it would quickly become clear that the Ferraris did have the pace to match the Alfa Romeos, or to compete with them, but more on that in a moment. First, we should talk about the championship situation. Ferrari resurgence or not, only the 3 Alfa Romeo drivers were in contention for the World Championship at this final race. Fangio on 26 points, Fagioli 24, Farina 22. Fangio and Farina had 3 scoring results. Fagioli had 4, all second places. So, since Fagioli would have to drop a second place if he won, his maximum points score was actually 27. Thus, Fangio, with a win or a second place, would guarantee the title for him, as he would reach 32 points, which Farina couldn't possibly beat. In essence, he had to not be outscored by 5 by anyone. Given Fangio's 3 wins, most of the possible ties favor him, although if Farina won, then it was up in the air. Farina needed to be at least 3rd with the fastest lap in order to have any chance, and needed to beat Fangio by 5. Fagioli needed to win with the fastest lap, with Fangio not scoring, and Farina 3rd or lower. Win with the fastest lap was the only possible way for Fagioli to win the championship at this point. Despite his seemingly good position, Farina had a much better chance of taking it from Fangio. Once qualifying actually got underway, the Alfa Romeos did not lock out the front row for once, although Juan Manuel Fangio did take pole position with a 158.6. However, his Ferrari rival Alberto Ascari was only 0.2 of a second behind, quite a tight margin for this era, with Farina 1.6 seconds back, and then Alfa Romeo's usual test driver, Consalvo Sanisi, 4th on the front row. The second row had Fagioli, Dorino Serafini, we mentioned him back at the start, you might recall, an Italian motorcycle champion who Ferrari brought in as Villarizzi's replacement for this race. Piero Taruffi, the 5th Alfa Romeo driver for the round. And Raymond Sommer in his Talbot, 10 seconds slower than Fangio, and the leading non-Alfa Romeo or Ferrari driver here in Italy. The third row had Franco Roll in his Maserati. He was another Italian driver. Robert Manzone in his Gordini. Guy Mares in his Talbot. Trintignant in the other Gordini. So pretty good pace from the Gordinis here, actually, after a lackluster season. The fourth row, Louis Rosier in his Talbot. Henry Louveau in his Talbot. Prince Bira in his Maserati, and Tancelin in another Talbot. The fifth row, Baron de Graffenried in his Maserati. Peter Whitehead in his Ferrari, Louis Chiron in his Maserati, and Pierre Levey in his Talbot. The sixth row, Cuth Harrison in his ERA, Johnny Clace in his Talbot, Felice Bonetto in what was actually a modified Milano Spiluzzi car. You'll recall this is Il Pirata, who had been using a Milano modified engine all season in a Maserati car. Now he had a car that was modified enough, sort of based on the Maserati, to actually be its own Milano car. And David Murray in his Maserati. And at the back, Clemente Biondetti in what was technically a Ferrari, but retrofitted with a Jaguar engine to create some sort of appalling chimera vehicle, obviously being 32 seconds slower than Fangio. It was probably not a well-advised modification, but he'd made it. Franco Camati in his Maserati, and Paul Pietsch in another Maserati, who was 60 seconds slower than Fangio somehow, and was allowed to start anyway. Welcome to 1950, everyone. Here we have a nice view of the starting grid as it looked at the time. Yes, it was 4 wide. I haven't just been doing that for fun, everyone. The width of the starting grid was basically just dependent on the width of the track at that time. However many cars it could support was how wide it was. There was no standardization. As the race actually started, well, Bonetto was unable to start at all due to numerous issues, so there were only 26 actual starters. Farina jumped into the lead from Fangio and Sanisi, a 2-place gain, while Ascari dropped right back to 4th behind both Farina and Sanisi. Pietsch's engine failed on the line, taking him out immediately. That might have something to do with why he was 60 seconds slower than everyone else in qualifying. As the first lap went on, Ascari, having dropped back to 4th, proceeded to pass Sanisi and Fangio, putting himself into 2nd and set off after Farina, promising a thrilling battle for the lead. By the second lap, the inevitable engine failures on the high-power Monza circuit began, as Prince Bira was the first out with an engine failure. The front 5 ran nearly nose to tail, essentially, in what was then a slipstream-dependent circuit, with no chicanes, of course, until on lap 11, Sanisi was the first to drop out with an engine failure, a very promising success for the Ferraris. And better still, on lap 14, Ascari drafted his way past Farina and took the lead, the first successful Ferrari challenge to Alfa Romeo on pure pace of the season. Meanwhile, further back in the field, Chiron was out with a loss of oil pressure, and Trintignant had a burst oil pipe, which meant Gordini's good qualifying results were entirely undone already. On lap 15, Franco Camati, at the very back in his Maserati, came in to retire, a rare voluntary retirement, as Camati felt uncompetitive and decided it wasn't worth the risk to race if he was just going to be at the back anyway. Given the casualty rate in this era, that's a remarkably mature viewpoint, actually. He was probably right. By lap 16, Farina was back in the lead ahead of Ascari as the top 4, really even the top 6 to some extent, continued to battle their way around the track. Henry Louveau had a brake failure and was out as well, although fortunately all the retirements thus far were entirely okay. On lap 17, Biondetti's atrocious Chimera Ferrari Jaguar retired from last with an engine failure, and I'm going to have to say good riddance on that one, folks. Unfortunately, on lap 21, Ferrari's hopes proved indeed too good to be true, as Ascari retired with an engine failure brought on by a hastily made porous block failing on the long straights. Ascari promptly called in Serafini and took over his car, which cost that car position to Taruffi. So for a while it was Alfa Romeo 1, 2, 3, and 4 in Italy. As cars continued to drop out, Johnny Claes going out the next lap in his Talbot with overheating issues. Unfortunately, well, at this point, Fangio was in a championship-winning position, set to take 6 points, which would have put him at 32 out of reach of Farina. But unfortunately, the next lap, he retired with either a gearbox failure or a broken engine valve. I've seen both cited in different sources. Either way, he called in Taruffi and took over his car, which led Ascari back ahead into what was now 3rd, leaving Farina and Fagioli running together at the front, Alpha 1-2. Retirements continued as Levey was the next out with a gearbox failure, and by now we were down to barely over half of those who had started still running, not yet halfway through the race. Unfortunately, any chance Fangio still had at the championship effectively ended, as on lap 34 his new car also developed engine problems and he retired for a second time, this time for good. Although he had set the fastest lap before retiring and no one would be able to beat it, as it turned out. Which did put him, to be fair, at a theoretical 37 points, meaning Farina at least had to take second place in order to win the championship. That said, he was leading and it didn't look like much of a problem. Franco Roll, who had slipped back behind the Talbots over time, proceeded to retire on lap 39, apparently out of sheer frustration at his Maserati's lack of speed. So that's 2 retirements due to just being too slow in this race. No sports psychologists yet, I guess. On lap 42, it was Mares out with a cracked oil pipe, which let Rosier into the points, and now only 10 runners left after Mares' retirement of an attrition rate of nearly 2/3 already. And that just kept going, as on lap 48, it was Sommer out with a gearbox failure from an excellent position, leaving Rosier and Atanceline both in the points for Talbot. And Sommer had been consistently one of the fastest Talbot drivers since leaving for Ferrari, but had been pretty plagued by unreliability, even by the standards at the time, so unfortunate for him. On lap 50, in the second pit stop cycle, Ascari managed to pass Fagioli and get himself into second, but there would be no resumption of the fight with Farina, who was cruising over a minute in the lead by the end of the pit stops, in an untouchable position. And the retirements kept on happening as Cuth Harrison was next out on lap 51 with a radiator failure in his Maserati. No. I'm sorry, he was actually driving an ERA. I've gotten that backwards with Murray somehow. Anyway, Murray was next out on lap 56 with a gearbox failure anyway, so that left only 7 cars running. And in the end, all 7 of them would finish. All the drama was done after 3/4 of the race, and Farina cruised the last 20 laps to victory in the race and the World Championship. Via Ascari, Serafini became the only driver to podium in their only ever World Championship Grand Prix, since it was technically an Ascari-Serafini shared car in second, and Fangio grabbed the fastest lap. But not enough. Farina won by a minute 18.6 seconds over the Serafini-Ascari shared car. Fagioli was third, a minute 35.6 back. 5 laps down on the leading Alfa Romeos and Ferraris. Louis Rosier and Philippe Tanceline in their Talbots grabbed the remaining points. Also finishing 8 laps down, Baron de Graffenried in his Maserati and Whitehead in his privateer Ferrari. And of course, a hilarious array of 20 cars retired from the race. So that left the final championship standings as such. Nino Farina with 30 points, 3 wins, and 1 fourth place with fastest lap, won the championship by 3 points over Juan Manuel Fangio. Fagioli scored 24 points, although it would have been 28 under the modern system. Best of the rest was Louis Rosier with 13. Then Ascari with 11, the best Ferrari driver, falling short of Rosier's tally, and really not a lot to show for a pretty shaky up-and-down season for Ferrari. The 2 podiums, of course, a few points in Belgium, but 2 races that Ferrari had not deigned to participate in at all, and a retirement to boot, general reliability problems. Not really a first Formula One season to remember for Ferrari. Then we have the Americans, of course, with their Indy 500 points, and then also doing well, Prince Bira, 5 points to the Thai Prince, 4 each for Peter Whitehead and his privateer Ferrari, Louis Chiron at his home race, Reg Parnell at his home race during his Alfa Romeo guest drive, and the American Maury Rose. And the other points finishers for the year, Dorino Serafini, Yves Giraud-Cabontius, Raymond Sommer, although Sommer's 3 retirements in later races pretty much all been from point scoring positions, so very bad run for him there. Robert Manzone, the American Cecil Green, Philippe Tancelin, and Felice Bonetto, the Pirate, Eugene Chaboud, and 2 more Americans. Again, the Constructors' Championship wasn't official, but if it had been, well, obviously, Alfa Romeo would have finished on absolute maximum points. The only points they sort of miss are 2 fastest lap points, and those aren't even counted if we take best 4 of 7. Ferrari would nab second, at least, over Talbot, courtesy of Whitehead's privateer car finishing in France. That said, quite an impressive season by Talbot Lago Talbot, really, given their lack of pace relative to the Alfas and Ferraris. Maserati, on the other hand, a very shaky season. And, well, Gordini didn't really race the full season, but their results were nothing special where they did. Fortunately, I can't complete the season without mentioning that just a week after the Italian Grand Prix, Raymond Sommer was participating in a Formula 2 Haute-Garonne Grand Prix in France when his Formula 2 Cooper suffered a steering failure and flipped over. He was wearing a canvas helmet and was killed instantly when the car landed upside down. He was the only major fatality of the year in Formula racing, but the inevitable reminder that 1950 was an extremely dangerous year to be driving a Formula 1 car, or a Formula 2 car for that matter. Now, despite that somber note, the season was not quite over, as there were several non-championship races after Italy, notably the Goodwood Trophy on the 30th of September in Goodwood. Johnny Clays actually took pole, but the winner was Reg Parnell in a highly experimental BRM powered by, I believe this was the one that was powered by an absurd V16 engine. Although I could be wrong about that, but I don't think I am. Just a moment. No, yeah, this had an absurd V16 engine, which didn't work most of the time, but was hilariously overpowered by the standards of 1950 when it did. Then Prince Beer and his Maserati, Bob Gerard and an ERA, de Graffenried and Shaw Taylor. And the final major race of the season was the Gran Premio de Peñarín in Pedralbes, Spain, Pedralbes Circuit in Barcelona, Spain. Alfa Romeo didn't bother to show up, where Ferrari sent 4 cars. Well, Ferrari sent 3 cars, plus Whitehead was still around, I believe. Ascari, Serafini, and Taruffi were all driving for Ferrari and proceeded to take a 1-2-3 ahead of a Tancelin and his Talbot, de Graffenried, and his Maserati. And that does bring us to the end of the season. It was quite an interesting season, essentially dominated by Alfa Romeo, of course. However, the head-to-head was mainly between Farina and Fagioli, and when trying to compare them, it's rather difficult, as they never finished a race without one of them either being crippled or retired due to mechanical issues or a crash. The difference really has to come down to Fangio crashing out in Britain in the first race of the season. Without that, he would have won the championship, and it's, I'm pretty sure, the only retirement either of them had that wasn't purely mechanical. So, that said, in qualifying, both Fangio and Farina had the number of Fagioli quite comfortably. Fangio beat Farina 4-2 in qualifying. They were also definitely faster than Fagioli in the races. The only race I'll give to Farina over Fangio is, again, Britain. Otherwise, they never finished the same race together. Now, an interesting note, given what we know with the benefit of hindsight that Ascari will go on to achieve, Villarizi, prior to his crash in Geneva, outqualified Ascari 3-0 in the races Ferrari actually participated in this season, although Ascari managed to beat him in the only race they both finished. But it's quite an interesting testament to the pace Villarizi had, given that he actually scored No points this season due to just sheer unreliability and bad luck. In any case, as we head towards the 1951 season, it promises to be quite a thriller with Ferrari's new 375, mechanical problems more or less worked out, promises to bring them up to the pace of the Alfa Romeos and make it a highly competitive season. Fangio versus Ascari, or perhaps Farina versus Ascari, as they would have thought at the time. Tune in a couple of weeks to see our coverage of that. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more. I plan to take this series forwards with 1951 and then onwards up to the present, perhaps every few weeks. Thank you for watching, everybody.